Hello. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was January 9th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is The Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Really excited to talk about today's document because it's the first time that I'm talking about a document where there's a woman writing a letter to another woman. All of the previous documents thus far have been, involving men in some way as either the writer or the recipient. And so today's letter is a welcome change. Violant is writing to Maria de Luna. I might have mentioned Maria de Luna in passing earlier on the episode. Maria de Luna is a big deal. First of all, she is Martí's wife. So basically this is the second most powerful woman in the Crown of Aragon at this time. But Maria de Luna has a background. She is from if not the wealthiest family in the Crown of Aragon, one of the top 5 wealthiest families. The de Luna family is incredibly powerful and wealthy. And in fact, Maria de Luna's uncle becomes Pope a few years down the road. Well, talking about the Avignon papacy, so history actually remembers Pedro de Luna, who is Pope Benedict. Oh gosh, what number? Benedict the something something. He's remembered as the anti-pope. So this is a very prestigious, powerful family with so much established network connection to other families and political powerhouses in the Crown of Aragon. So Maria de Luna is very well connected and has deep roots in the Crown of Aragon. I say all that in order to bring out a contrast. Violant, remember, she grew up in France. And Joan set out to have a French wife. The way that he got together with Violant is that he sent a group of emissaries into France and asked them to basically compile a dossier of marriageable high up French ladies. And so and actually should specify that the age difference was quite significant and very hard for us in the modern age to wrap our heads around. So the age that Violant leaves France and moves to the Crown of Aragon to marry Joan, she's 15 years old. And so that is not what we would say in our time as a lady or a woman. We would say that is a 15-year-old girl. And so trying to figure out how to get our minds around what was considered a normal marriageable age in the Middle Ages, in the medieval era, it's very difficult for us and not easy at all to support or defend. Can only say that the notions that we have about childhood and adolescence are very much modern creations, and not to make excuses, but just to observe that anthropologically there is variation across humanity and over time in regard to questions of when childhood ends. In our modern time, though, we don't have these questions. We are very clear on having a society that will not accept a child marriage as okay. So, all right. Maria de Luna is from a very well-connected, wealthy family, and she, by all accounts, is a very competent and responsible leader. Núria Sierras Fernandez has written a fantastic book about Maria de Luna, and it's a wonderful parallel to thinking about Violant, because after Joan dies in 1396, Martí is off in Sicily, and it takes him a really long time to get back to Barcelona to inherit the throne. And this is to say that there were no surviving male heirs at the time that Joan died. And so Martí takes several months to get to Barcelona, and in an interesting parallel to what we're looking at right now with the beginning of the reign of Joan and Violant, just as Violant is stepping up and running things while waiting for Joan to arrive, Maria de Luna does that in 1396 and has to really get way deeper into governance because it takes so much longer for Martí to arrive from Sicily, and also because that transition of power in 1396 is way more of a crisis. And the reason for that, without getting too digressive here, is that the circumstances surrounding Joan's death in May of 1396 are problematic. I would use the word suspicious. Other historians have not. Definitely sudden. So Maria de Luna is a really interesting figure, and the portrait that Núria Sierras Fernandez paints of Maria de Luna is one of just very responsible, very organized, very stable personality. And Violant, by contrast, has gone down in history as more aggressive, more hot-tempered. But I think the question that historians of Violant de Bar, such as Don Brach Prince, who started out a whole new revision of Violant de Bar in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, and now Claire Ponce, who's currently writing about Violant de Bar, historians that look at Violant, they're starting to question a lot of the characterization of Violant as ill-tempered or hot-headed, and to notice how a lot of that has to do with the animus against her for being an outsider, for being somebody who had come in from France, and also maybe how Violant was pushing the boundaries in a way that made people angry because of what Joan was doing too. And that there's a dynamic here that upset a lot of people that has to do with the way that Joan and Violant were working together. That last little twist is my own theory of this case. In any event, what we have in this letter, dated January 9th, 1387, is Violant informing Maria de Luna that Pere has died, which to me is a bit of a mystery, because I would be super surprised if Maria de Luna had not already been informed that Pere had died. I mean, that's pretty hot news. So maybe Violant is starting this out by just is a matter of courtesy, saying, hey, I'm going to share this important news with you that the king is dead, and long live the new king, and I'm queen. She starts out the letter with a molt cara. We always love that. That's nice and tender. So this one starts out molt cara sor. And then the second sentence in the letter also reiterates molt cara sor, most dear sister. So Violant is addressing Maria de Luna in the same way that she addresses Martí. And that led me on my initial read of this letter to say, okay, this kind of tone here is just nice and, friendly. And the content of the letter is basically saying, hey, come to Barcelona, please. But I just was kind of curious what would happen if I fed this into ChatGPT. And the kind of analysis that I might get, was there anything hidden in this letter that maybe ChatGPT might find and could kind of spark some additional questions in my mind? And that's exactly what happened. So ChatGPT has an interesting interpretation of this letter, and the AI has made an interpretation that this letter is actually not all that polite, but is instead a more assertive and commanding summons, that Violant is summoning Maria de Luna to Barcelona. It's an interesting angle on this, and I would have to have way deeper familiarity with the tone of the language of letters like this than I do now. I'm still a relative beginner at looking at these documents, and so maybe if I come back to this about 6 months from now, it'll seem obvious to me that this is a summons, that there's really kind of like a power play happening here, where Violant is asserting that she has the power to demand the presence of Maria de Luna, like as a subordinate. Or maybe that's not what's going on here at all. Maybe it is a request. The key phrase that ChatGPT pulled out that is, I think, the one that's we're really trying to figure out in a close read whether it's demanding or not, is in the second to the last full line, where basically Violant is saying, oh, sorry, it's the third to the last line, kind of in the center, al pus breu. So basically saying, move it. It should be fast the way you get here. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the tone that is being conveyed in this letter. Maybe, it's not going to come across to Maria de Luna as a sort of edging on rudeness level of summons. But, maybe it is. And, I asked a series of questions the other day about Martí and how Martí reacts to being issued directives from Violant. And the same thing can be asked about Maria. Is Maria de Luna at this point in full support of Violant? Or is she feeling a certain kind of annoyance at a level of presumption from this foreigner, this French lady who is now going to become the queen of the Crown of Aragon? So a lot of questions about the operation and exercise of power are at work here. And I talked about this quite a bit in previous episodes. But I go in deeper on this question of the exercise of power in some of the show notes on the webpage for this document on the website. So do check that out. There's a lot of really interesting bibliographic citations if you're wanting to learn more about how scholars today discuss the exercise of power by medieval women. And I can highly recommend some of the works that I had mentioned yesterday, but also I want to mention two more. First, an article by Marie Kelleher titled "What Do We Mean by Women and Power?" That's from 2016. And then a really great contrast to the book by Nuria Sierras Fernandez about Maria de Luna is one by Elizabeth Castine about Johanna of Naples. It's titled "From She-Wolf to Martyr, the Reign and Disputed Reputation of Joanna I of Naples." And it's also about the 14th century and about a woman who pushed the boundaries of power, and a way more violent fate awaited Joanna of Naples versus that experienced by Violant and Maria de Luna, and also Sibylla de Fortia, who the three of them in the Crown of Aragon, they had a lot of ups and downs and excitement, but their physical safety was never in super risk. I'm sure Sibylla's pretty frightened at this moment, but she ends up being okay and lives a long life after this, long enough to see Violant go down after Joanne's death in 1396. All right, so a lot of really interesting stuff being written about powerful women in the Middle Ages. Oh, but one last thing to mention about this letter before I bring this episode to a close, which is that Violant mentions the Infanta Joanna is there with her. And this is a really interesting moment because I had not understood that there were any of the children around. But this is actually Violant's stepdaughter, a daughter that Joanne had with his previous wife, Mata of Armagnac. And by all accounts, Violant and Joanna got along very, very well. But I think that mentioning Joanna in this moment helps to maybe imply a little bit to Maria that the women are going to be a force together, working together on Team Next Gen for this upcoming reign. So I think that's a really interesting moment that I wanted to make sure I didn't forget to talk about, that Violant mentions that the Princess Joanna is there with her in this moment. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, then this episode has succeeded according to the criteria dissatisfaction guaranteed, which is the motto of this podcast. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear more about the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Take care.